Here is another book review, and this one is of My Life with Charles Manson by Paul Watkins. Overall score, I would give it a 3 out of 5. I would say it was pretty painfully moderate. I'm going to, of course, start off this review as saying, as always, that I'm not going to summarize the book, but rather review it. If you're coming across this review without ever having read the book, there are going to be spoilers and stuff that doesn't make sense. Like I said before, I give this book a 3 out of 5 stars. This is not because it's an average read or moderately easy to process and get through. Rather, when averaged out, for me, it was a 3 out of 5. First, I would like to start off with the good that's in the book. It emphasizes more on the culture of the Manson family. Unlike other books at the time when it was released, such as Helter Skelter and Child of Satan, Child of God. Though Tex Watson's book had come out a year prior to Paul's in 1978, it of course focused more on Tex's story as opposed to talking about the group in general. Paul's book gives more background story to previously overlooked characters in the Manson mythos, members and non-members alike. People like Brooks Poston, Juan Flynn, and Paul Crockett mainly, along with other members that I hadn't even heard of. Unlike Susan and Tex's books, though, it seems that Paul did not change the names of some of the real people in the book, as I assume that Bo and Ginny were really referred to that, at least in real life, even if those were nicknames. It was interesting reading the small part about the member named Ginny, as she seemed to have appeared in a phone call for an interview that Paul did 2 years before he died. The book had descriptions of the culture that really showed the cult mentality of the group, whether Paul meant to show that trait or not. Personally, I think that Paul did not realize how much the group acted like a cult, and during his examples of showing how the group was peaceful and loving, it came across more like a brainwashed group, constantly moaning for Charlie. My main example of this is the failed acid trip in Chapter 9. What I also liked about the book was that it gave more description to what the houses in the desert looked like. Putting myself in the time frame that this book came out, there really wasn't that much to go off of in the first decade after the murders. So, as to what the desert houses and stuff like that really looked like, this is perhaps the only book that ever talked about there being actual vegetation and lush gardens at one of the ranches, whereas other pieces of literature didn't delve as deep. I do wonder if this is because other writers didn't know this, as in if they weren't members of the family and they only researched their information, this of course wouldn't be something they would have known, especially if they hadn't read Paul's book, which I'm sure most haven't, because of the fact it is a very hard to find and rare book. But the interesting thing is that books that were by other family members, Tex, Diane, Susan, they seem to leave out these certain facts. That's a common thing in general with all members of this group. One person says one thing, and even though it's true, the others never bothered to corroborate this fact either. I just don't know why. Paul's book also gave more evidence to show Charlie's racism and prejudices. Many other pieces of literature before and after Paul's book stated that Charles Manson was a racist, and that Helter Skelter was to be one of the greatest race wars. In fact, it was supposed to be the final war. Yet, direct examples of this are almost nowhere to be seen. It was nice to have examples from one of the family members themselves to show this. Finally, it was nice to see more examples of Charlie's love for music from a family member themselves, even if it meant that he pushed his music on others. Though I don't think that Paul talked about playing music with Charlie for the sake of pushing the Terry Melcher did him wrong theory. It actually gives some weight, though, to that theory. Paul's book actually brought up the time where Terry Melcher stood the family up when they were prepared to play with and see him. And honestly, that's pretty much where all of the good parts of this review end. I have a lot of grievances with this book, and some of it is because I have spent so much time on this project. But the more I have focused on the book, the more holes I have seen in it. And I forgot to actually write it down in my review, so I'm just going to say it right now. One thing I just cannot stand in the book, all of the, the first thing out of all the bad stuff, the first thing I just cannot stand was Paul's creepy, so creepy descriptions of every single woman. Was it really necessary to talk about how every single girl was sexually attractive in this way and that way? Oh, Beau's upturned breasts. Oh, she was a cosmic sex cookie. Like, my God. You're writing this book 10 years after the fact, and apparently you still want to fuck them? Like, my God. That is just so weird. Like, it was so creepy to me. So weird. Like, what is the point? There is no value to this in the book. We don't need to know about the breast profile of these underage girls, of these barely legal women. Thanks, though. Try again. But anyway, now going back to the stuff I actually wrote down. First, though, on my list, Paul Watkins, though, didn't seem to understand his own pretentiousness. And a lot of the description in his books are very pretentious. Paul called himself a professional musician in his book and acted like he knew every single piece of music theory that there was to know. When you watch the Manson documentary from 1973, the actual sight of him playing with Brooks Poston was nowhere what I would call professional. In fact, everyone in that movie looked incredibly stupid. So knowing how that movie went, and then years later for Paul to write that he was a professional musician, to me, is honestly cringe at best. I can't help but wonder what his definition of a professional was, since he was still out in the middle of the desert playing the flute and dancing with worms. I find it ironic that he thought of himself that way and believed highly in the musical capabilities of the family. He stated over and over in the book that everyone on the ranch got really good at their craft and would be so in tune together. Unfortunately, there is no proof of this professional mastery in music and singing, save for some clips in the 1973 documentary. The only person in the entire family I have ever heard to be a great musician in multiple sources is Catherine Sher. Multiple sources have stated that she was a fantastic singer, which I am referencing mostly Susan Atkins and Diane Lake's books, but I know that there are still more sources beyond that have said that about Catherine Scher. While I do realize that record deals and pressing vinyls are not the only indication of success, in fact, I don't consider that part to be the only indicator. It seriously appeared to me, though, that Paul thought a lot more of himself than he really was. And at the time of recording this video, I recently came across that, 1997 CD, so to speak, of the Family Jams, I think that's what it's called, where all of the songs are credited to Charlie, but he's not singing. In fact, it's actually Steve Grogan singing, and then of course the girls are in the background. And after having listened to that album, I could say, you know what, Paul? You were wrong. You were so wrong. I do think that Steve Grogan had really good vocals. I do. He had a very nice and solid voice. But the girls in the background singing, it was just creepy. And it's not because of the connotations of Tate LaBianca and all that. That actually has nothing to do with it, you know. I mean, I listen to a lot of crazy music, and I'm thinking like, okay, you know, hearing that album and why? Who the fuck would listening to that album and thinking about that time period and how Terry Melcher and other people didn't want to sign them? Charles Manson's attitude aside, I think that a lot of people heard the group, people heard the Manson family sing, and they were probably just creeped out. I mean, seriously, you know, it's kind of fucking weird. It is, you know. So anyway, but even still, you know, going to, like, applying that to my review and really to Paul's book, you know, Paul kept saying, oh, we were so good, you know. And, like, yeah, there was other people who recorded and people refused to release those tapes of Manson's music, but at the same time too, I mean, at the time when this book was written, there was no proof, you know. If this was 1979, I would have no way of listening to the Manson family's music to know for sure if what Paul Watkins was saying is true. And Paul died before the Family Jams was released. And so of course he couldn't, I don't know, do something to prove it, blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of my point right there. This book came out before we could actually listen to anything to whether prove or deny his claim. And then once we do have something, it sucks. One of my other grievances with Paul's book is the excessive and nonsensical listings of people and things that were there. There was absolutely no need to list over 3 people or 3 items when going over descriptions at times. I could almost understand wanting to document everyone that did not go to certain areas, as there are very meticulous Manson timelines out there. And yet, in some situations, it would have been easier to just say who did not go. The example that comes to mind with this is when the gang took the bus up to Mendocino so that the girls could go to court. Instead of saying the names of the 3 people who didn't go, Paul felt the need to list over 5 people. I mean, this is just a crime in writing. It's times like these that I wonder how much his co-writer Guillermo Soldad did, considering that he was a member of the University of Santa Barbara's faculty. I feel like Soledad only decided to replace certain words with Paul that certain words that Paul had with more complex ones, so as to create an illusion of intelligence in Watkins's writing. To me, an example of this would be Paul's constant use of the word corpulent. Watkins would use this word to describe members of the family or other characters, while it is not being a correct descriptor of those people. Once you saw actual pictures of them, you could see the difference. Physical descriptions of people were grossly wrong, while his perception of others was off. Or he just couldn't seem to remember what they actually looked like. Charlie was constantly described as having been super short at 5'2", though there are videos and stories from other people saying that Charlie was 5'6" or 5'7". Despite all the stories from Susan Atkins, she stated Charlie was 5'6" in her book. George Stimson, who knew Charlie for years, stated the same thing. Whether you personally believe this or not is up to you, but I personally believe that Charlie was taller than most people, like Watkins and Watson would lead you to believe. One of my reasons for this is actually Danny DiCarlo. In Watkins's book, he stated that Danny was 5'8", of which he considered to be short for some reason. Granted, other books I've read have stated that Danny DiCarlo was 5'6". In a photo of Danny and Charlie standing during one of the raids, you see them next to each other. This is enough for me to say, okay, Charlie was definitely taller than it seems, or Danny was shorter than what they say he was. Paul himself seemed to have been projecting his own insecurities in his descriptions of people, as he was 5'5". Men that were 6 feet tall were considered gigantic, and 5'8", which is only 4 inches shorter, was small to him, despite being shorter than both. Paul also described many people as corpulent or fat when they were nowhere near that, such as Bruce Davis, Stephanie Rowe, Juanita Wildbush, and Paul Crockett. I'm unsure if this was to make people look bad, or maybe just more like natural, I guess, since at the time people wouldn't have the photos available to verify his descriptions either way, as we do today. Personally, this makes all physical descriptions useless because they're flat out wrong. What is really interesting to me is that in an interview before his book came out, Paul stated that he and Charlie were the exact same size. So which one is it, Paul? Was he the same height as you, or was he shorter? Despite interviews with him and the cover of the book saying that he can explain it with what caused the murders, the book actually leaves many questions unfulfilled. In some cases, it creates them. Who was supplying the drugs? Where were they buying the drugs from? Why didn't anyone seem to notice that Charlie was a pedophile? And why wasn't anyone alarmed by the presence of Diane Lake, who was 15 years old? What was this talk about random mafia members? Why didn't he bring up Sandra Good's baby? Why don't we ever seem to know anything about Joel Pugh? The book has a lot of grammatical and statistical errors that create more holes than fills them. For example, reading the book, it took me a few times, but I realized, oh, Dean and Ruth Ann Morehouse, their last name is spelled wrong. Paul and Guillermo Soldan left out an O, so instead of Moore, it was just More. And I was like, really? There are plenty of other people's names spelled incorrectly like that. To me, it's not like a huge, horrible thing, but I think of it as, I thought you were close with these people and you can't even spell their names right. He was practically showing his love for Diane Lake, but he spelled her name wrong too. I don't understand what the point of Squeaky and Ginny trying to pass Bruce Davis LSD in the courtroom was. Was this some sort of poorly thought out ploy to try to get him the insanity plea? Not that it would have worked anyway, but just what was the point, Even still, why did he even bring that up in the book? Why were most of the other men in the book depicted as morons, except for Charlie and Paul? Other books, such as Jeff Gein's, shows Bruce Davis to be a more dominant male character. On one hand, Paul claimed that all the people in the group were smart and creative, and yet he describes many of them in his book as pretty much quiet robots. How, for example, could Paul not see, though, that he was a gullible fool in 1969 when he wrote the book 10 years later? It seems to me that he either didn't want to admit it, or he really couldn't see that he and a majority of the others were conned. Those that weren't cons were conned. And I'm not sure he wanted to admit to that. I feel like in some ways he wanted to be a level above these people around him. Even further, I don't understand how Paul could say that the family was peaceful and about making love when Charlie's rap included beating on women even before the talks of Helter Skelter. There seems to be an inconsistency with that also, where Tex Watson claimed that Charlie was talking about Helter Skelter, though quietly, even back in the Haight-Ashbury days. And yet Paul claims that the idea came after the White Album. And yet I believe it was Paul, too, that stated that Charlie sort of talked about it during San Francisco also. I wonder why Paul thought of the family as peaceful when he provided the example of Charlie himself beating on a pregnant Susan Atkins. Paul so easily overlooked the fact that the family would still hustle and steal before the race war stuff, himself included. So, it's weird because it was okay then for him to lie, cheat, steal, to lure high school girls to a pedophile on false pretenses, swindle people out of their money to appease Charlie, to commit Grand Theft Auto, while still claiming that the family was good and peaceful. In reality, he is just as bad as the rest of them and could have faced serious jail time too. Despite his talking about peace and being at one with nature, Paul still went back to the family and went on to supposedly take charge, while Charlie was incarcerated after the desert arrests. I only say supposedly because other literature doesn't seem to mention this at all, and has maintained that it was instead Squeaky Fromy who was calling the shots, and organized everything, which makes sense because she was Charlie's number one girl, and by far the most devoted. I have also never heard anywhere else that Squeaky would have seizures after sex. If these are really real or something that Charlie incited, aka she was acting, I don't know. I haven't read this anywhere else, though I still have yet to to read Lynette's book. Despite all the questions people had asked Watkins on how could this happen, he really didn't give any answer to any of it. Instead, he replied with essentially, society. I don't understand why Paul went back to Charlie's family after leaving and stating earlier in the book that he felt so much horror when Charlie stated, "We have to show Blackie how to do it." If Paul knew what they were doing was wrong, why would he go back? Why go to court against Charlie, then still visit him in jail? How could Paul have really been surprised that Sandy, Squeaky, and Nancy Pittman were mad at him? Paul seemed to refuse to admit that he was stupid, but instead claims that it was the effect of programming, and that's what this book is about. Better yet, he won't admit that he liked the power, and maybe he had greed for Charlie's position. And that's another thing. His book is the only book that I have ever heard of Paul Watkins being the second in power. And I swear to God that any sort of book or interview with any of these men, they'll say, "Oh, I was in power. I was the second in power. I was Charlie's right-hand man." You know, it's just everyone says that. Okay, sure. You know. Paul also makes claims in his book that I have not seen in other pieces of literature, of course, that I hadn't even stated already in the review. Like, for example, he mentioned that Sadie was so completely enthralled in Charlie's rap. Other books did not portray her that way, including Atkins herself. It's interesting to me that even people like Diane Lake didn't say this. I feel like watching interviews alone can disprove this claim, and I don't understand Paul's point of this. Pretty much, I think anybody that reads the Manson mythos will know that Susan Atkins was the most defiant member, or at least woman, towards Charlie, and she was really a thorn in his side. Granted, in some ways, I do think she believed some bits of helter-skelter, but Susan Atkins was most definitely just there for the drugs, for the most part. There are a lot of parts of the book that I just found flat out stupid. Watkins tried to portray himself as the peace-loving, friendly hippie that was a bit of a horny 18-year-old male. Yet, a lot of his experiences show how naive and gullible he was. And, of course, just flat out stupid. By the time the book came out, he was the same age as I am now. I am 28 and he was 29. You can't really forgive his age 10 years after the murders for still being naive and oblivious to the facts. The whole book was an insight to his personality as a teenager who needed someone to look up to and was incredibly impressionable. I'm surprised that not once did he stop and think, why? Why would Charlie immediately want to bring him in after less than one day? How could he not have seen that as weird? As seen later in the book, Charlie would use Diane Lake to have sex with Paul and lure him in again and again. There were times that he knew this, and he still had sex with her. This proves to me that he just didn't care, as long as he was satisfied. I'm trying to judge the book as the lone piece it is. Despite having read many other pieces of Manson literature, I want to solely focus on the book alone for what it is. But I do want to point out that there are points in the book that aren't mentioned elsewhere in other places. For example, the closeness of Diane and Paul and the times that they had sex together. This was not mentioned in Diane's book at all, despite her recollection coming out after his. Granted, she might not have ever even read his book. You might chalk that also up to it being decades later, but even still, I feel like for someone to have shared a large and deep part of themselves with you, wouldn't you still remember that years later? But I feel like Lake's book left out a lot of information overall. In some ways, Paul's book felt like a love letter to Diane. Despite not ending up with her and even being married by the time the book came out, he talked about her frequently enough that it was almost like she was a main character. I think that if a new person to the Manson lore were to pick up this book, they would be left confused. Much like how Helter Skelter starts off almost in the middle of the events and assumes the reader has prior knowledge of the situation, Paul's book does the same thing too. I would not recommend this as an introductory book to the situation, as it can incredibly skew a person's knowledge of the situation. I wish that Paul would have just told the truth and admitted that he was stupid during the whole situation. Just admit it, just admit that you didn't know what you were doing and was extremely gullible at the time. I feel like in his epilogue, he still sided with Manson, especially when he stated that he felt like people such as Tex Watson were no worse than Vietnam veterans that were drafted in the war, despite the fact that Tex Watson and Paul Watkins himself draft dodged. One interview with Paul before the book came out showed his own prejudices, and to me pointed out that he was pretty racist. Using racial slurs against Asians kind of proved to me that Charlie recruited people with the same biases as him. While nearing the end of the book, I realized that it came out 12 years before Paul died. I thought about how when the murders happened and Paul went to court, he was already halfway through his life, though he didn't know it. That to me, of course, is sad. With his death in 1990, the book has been left in some sort of copyright limbo, to where I don't know if my videos on reading the books are legal or not. I don't know who owns the thing anymore, and there's no information on the second author either. I don't know if Guillermo Soldad is even alive. Unfortunately, though, the book is very hard to find, and there's only been one printing of it. After the 1979 edition, there's nothing left. In Paul's, I believe, last interview, he had stated, of course, he had he had issues with the publisher of the book who posted his address at the back of the book in the, about section. But when I got my copy of the book and I looked at it, it wasn't there. Now, Paul kind of made it sound like there was a second printing, but I don't believe that there was. And either way, my copy of the book at the end of it just stated that Paul lived in Tacoma. Oh my God, it's raining. Lived in Tacoma, California, which, somebody could have driven there and found his house, but at the same time, too, I don't know. I don't feel like that would have really been such a huge deal. I don't know. I mean, it is what it is. But anyway, my last point is that rereading certain parts of the book, such as re-recording and going over paragraphs and sources for this review, I had noticed that the book is written in a way as if it's a narrative and not fact. And I actually have a problem with that because the book is more of a story and not, a piece of nonfiction. When you read a book, a large piece of fiction, for example, classical literature, things like Shakespeare, you have to look up, you're supposed to understand like literary concepts and things like that. And I noticed those literary concepts in Paul's book. For example, there's a lot of foreshadowing in the book and things that happened at one point in the early parts of the book that, oh my God, happened later, like at the end and with the trial, such as Paul getting a ring from Charlie and then Paul handing the ring to Squeaky. And then, somebody saying, Dean Morehouse saying Charlie was just a tuned in dude. And then at, I believe, the court trial, Paul had stated that Charlie believed that Hitler was just a tuned in dude. It's things like that. It's like, I think anybody, maybe if you were gullible, you would be like, oh my God, that's so scary. I can't believe it. But to me, I read the book and I noticed these concepts and the foreshadowing. And honestly, I thought it was stupid. I didn't believe it. I don't believe that was real at all. None of that kind of crap seemed true. And that's my main thing against the book. My bottom line is that there's a lot of it that's hard to believe because whether it's true or not, it is just so stupid.